"You smell like winter," the stranger said, and Mara froze with her hand still pressed flat against the cold iron of the gate. She had not expected anyone to be standing on the other side of it. The cemetery beyond the old Ashvale property line was supposed to be empty at this hour. It was always empty, had been empty every single night for the 3 years she had been cutting through it, on her way home from the late shift at the diner. The fog sat low and heavy between the headstones, and the single lamp at the far end of the path threw just enough light to make shadows move in ways she had learned to ignore. She was practical, she was tired. She had blisters on both heels and a container of leftover soup in her bag, and absolutely no patience for whatever this was. But she did not move. That was she would think about later, lying awake in her narrow bed with the radiator clicking. She did not move. Some part of her, that was older than thought, held her exactly where she was, palm flat against the iron, cold seeping up through her skin, and her eyes fixed on the man standing perhaps 4 feet away in the dark. He was tall. That was the first thing she registered. Tall in the way that made the fog seem to part for him, made the space he occupied feel different from the space around it, denser somehow, more real. He wore a coat that was too heavy for the season and too old in its cut, and his hair was dark and pushed back from a face that she could not fully read in the low light. But his eyes caught the distant lamplight and held it, and they were not a color she had a word for. Not brown, not gold, something between. He was looking at her the way people looked at things they had not expected to find. "I beg your pardon," Mara said, because she was from a small town in upstate New York where that was still something people said. And also because it gave her a second to think. "Winter," he said again. He tilted his head slightly to the left, as though he was listening to something she couldn't hear. Cedar and cold water, and something else. He paused, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I haven't smelled that in a very long time." "You're talking about my shampoo," she said flatly. Something shifted in his expression. It might have been surprise. It might have been the beginning of something else. "Perhaps," he said. She pushed the gate open anyway, because she was tired and cold, and the soup was getting lukewarm, and she refused to be intimidated in the cemetery she had been walking through, since before this man had apparently decided to take up residence in it. The iron hinges groaned in the way they always did, a low, reluctant sound, and she stepped through, and that was when it happened. The seal on his wrist began to glow. She didn't see it immediately. She felt it first, a warmth against her left side that had no business being there in the October air, and she looked down at her own hand and then up at his, and there it was. A mark on the inside of his left wrist, just above where his coat sleeve ended, burning with a deep amber light, the color of embers that have been sitting undisturbed for a very long time. The shape of it was intricate, and she couldn't take it all in at once. Lines folding into lines, something almost architectural in its complexity. It pulsed once, twice, like a heartbeat remembering itself. His whole body went still. Not the stillness of someone who was surprised. The stillness of someone who had been still for so long that stillness was his natural state. And this light, this warmth, this pulse, was the disruption. Mara stared at the mark on his wrist. Mara stared at his face. His face was doing something she couldn't name. "What is that?" she said. It was not entirely a question. "Something," he said very quietly. "That has not happened in 500 years. She should have run. Any reasonable person, in any reasonable story, would have run. But Mara Voss had not been particularly reasonable since the night 3 years ago, when her entire life had collapsed in a single phone call, and she had discovered, in the rubble of that particular disaster, that she was, at her core, a woman who moved toward strange things rather than away from them. It was a quality that had not served her especially well. She suspected it was about to cause her more trouble. She looked at the mark again. It was fading now, the light dimming back into something that looked like an old scar, intricate and dark against his skin. "You should come inside," she heard herself say. He looked at her with those not quite gold eyes for a long moment. "That," he said, "is either the most dangerous thing you could offer or the safest." "The diner's 2 blocks back and I have leftover chicken soup," she said. "Decide now, because I'm tired." He followed her. Of course he followed her. His name, he told her in the small warm kitchen of her rented apartment above the hardware store, was Calder. Just Calder. He said it the way people said names that had been stripped of everything that used to come after them. The way names sounded when they were all that was left of something larger. He sat at her kitchen table, which was actually a card table she had covered with a vinyl cloth printed with small blue flowers, and he folded his hands on the surface and watched her move around the space with the same careful attention a person gave to something they were trying to understand without asking the obvious questions. She put the soup on the stove. She kept her back to him longer than was strictly necessary, because she needed her face to do whatever it needed to do without anyone watching. He was not human. She knew that the way she knew when a storm was coming, not from any single sign, but from the accumulation of them. The way the air in her kitchen had changed when he walked in. The way the old iron skillet hanging above the stove had trembled very slightly on its hook when he passed beneath it. The way her cat, who had been asleep on top of the refrigerator for approximately 6 hours, had opened one eye and then opened it wider, and then silently, with great dignity, removed herself to somewhere further back in the apartment. "Your cat," he said. "She does that with strangers," Mara said. "She does that with old things," he said. "Animals have better sense than people." She turned around and looked at him over the pot. "How old?" He looked down at his hands, at the mark on his wrist, which was quiet now, dark and dormant. "Old enough that I've stopped counting in years," he said. "Old enough that the city this cemetery used to border is 3 cities ago." "The seal," she said. "That's what you are. That's what that mark is?" "The seal is a binding," he said. "It was placed on me by my own people, 512 years ago, because I was—" He paused. Something moved behind his eyes. "Because I was judged to be too dangerous to walk freely among those who could not contain me. The seal suppresses what I am, what I carry." He turned his wrist over on the table, showing her the mark face up. In the kitchen light, it looked like nothing so much as an old tattoo, faded and complex. "It has been still since the day it was placed, until tonight." "Until me," she said. "Until you," he agreed, and his voice was very neutral when he said it, the way voices were when they were working to contain something. Mara stirred the soup. "So what does it mean? That it glowed?" "It means," he said slowly, "that you are what my people called a Verath, a key in the modern translation, though that is imprecise. Someone whose nature is fundamentally complementary to mine. Someone in whose presence thee recognizes." He stopped again, and this time the pause was longer. "The binding was designed to release upon contact with the right person. My people believed that the punishment should be finite, that eventually, the one who could safely unmake it would appear." "You've been waiting 500 years for me to cut through a cemetery," Mara said. The corner of his mouth moved. "I've been waiting in the vicinities of several possible locations. The binding draws me to where it senses proximity. I've been in this city for 11 months. 11 months, she said. "And you've been hanging around the cemetery because you walk through it every Thursday and Saturday night," he said. "And each time you passed within a certain distance. The seal." He hesitated, and something almost uncomfortable crossed his face. It stirred, only slightly, not enough to see, but I felt it. "You've been watching me," Mara said. It wasn't entirely an accusation. She was aware of how it should have been, and how it wasn't. "Yes," he said simply. She set 2 bowls on the table. She sat down across from him. She pushed one bowl toward him and said, "Tell me what you are, and tell me what happens if I actually release you. And if you lie to me, I'll know, because I have been lied to by professionals and I know exactly how it sounds." He looked at the soup bowl. He looked at her. "I am one of the Ashveld. We are, there is no modern term that is entirely accurate. Your mythology would call us wardens, perhaps, or guardians, though both words are too passive. We hold things. We contain forces that would otherwise move unchecked through the world. There are fewer of us now than there were. There were 7 when my binding was laid." He paused. "I do not know how many remain. And what happens if I release you?" "I become again what I was before the binding," he said. "Full capacity, full access to what I carry." "Which is?" He looked at her steadily. "Winter," he said. "Cold in the sense that I explained to you is not accurate. I mean winter as a force, as a presence in the world. The stillness before snow, the pressure that comes before a freeze, the moment when everything that is going to die has died and what remains is clean. He watched her face. I understand that this is alarming. It's not alarming, she said. It's strange. Those are different things. She picked up her spoon. Eat the soup. He picked up his spoon. He ate the soup. And Mara watched him eat it and thought about the seal on his wrist and the way the air in her kitchen had changed, and she understood on some level she couldn't fully articulate that her life had just changed irrevocably in the space of about 40 minutes, and that the man eating chicken soup at her card table was at the center of it, and that she was not, despite all available evidence to the contrary, afraid. That was the beginning. Or perhaps it was the middle of something that had already begun, and she just hadn't known it. But for the purposes of what she could live through and understand, it was the beginning. His name was Calder, and he was 532 years old, and he had been sitting in the vicinity of that cemetery for 11 months waiting for her to get close enough. And now he was in her kitchen eating chicken soup from a bowl with small blue flowers on the rim that matched the vinyl cloth on the card table, and Mara Voss, who had survived a great deal of things she had not expected to survive, was going to have to figure out what to do with that. He came back the next Saturday. She left the gate unlatched. He brought coffee this time, from a place she didn't recognize, in cups that were too heavy and too warm. And they sat on the step above the cemetery path, and she asked him questions. And he answered them with the careful precision of someone who had spent a long time being very accurate with words. And she told him things that surprised her as she was saying them. About the phone call 3 years ago, about her mother's house that had to be sold, about the job at the diner that was supposed to be temporary and had become something else. He listened to all of it with the same quality of attention that she had noticed in the kitchen, that sense of something very old and very still turning itself entirely toward what she was saying. You don't give advice, she noticed. No, he said. Most people give advice. Most people are afraid of just hearing things, he said. It feels passive to them, like they're failing to help. And you're not afraid of that. I have been still for 500 years, he said. I am very comfortable with passive. That made her laugh, the first real laugh she'd produced in what felt like a long time, and she watched him watch her laugh with that careful expression, that attention that was starting to feel less like observation and more like something else, something that sat lower in the chest. She began to look forward to Saturdays with a specificity that embarrassed her. She began to notice that Thursday nights, when she walked through the cemetery and he was not there, their arrangement was Saturdays only, a boundary she had set without quite explaining why. She walked more slowly than she used to. She began to notice that when she was working the counter at the diner and a cold front moved through and the temperature dropped sharply, she thought of the mark on his wrist and felt something shift in the center of her chest. The second Saturday he told her about the binding and what it had felt like when it was placed. He described it the way a person described a physical wound, precisely and without melodrama, and she sat very still and listened and felt something in her go tight with anger on his behalf that surprised her with its intensity. 500 years, she said. Yes, for what? He looked out over the cemetery. The fog was lighter than it had been the first night, and she could see the older headstones from where they sat, the ones with the carved names worn down to suggestions of letters. I killed someone who deserved it, he said. That is the simplified version. The longer version involves politics among my people that I have had enough distance from to understand were, at minimum, more complex than I was capable of seeing at the time. Do you still think the person deserved it? Yes, he said, though I have had considerable time to examine that belief from every available angle. What was his name? Her name, he said quietly. Solvith. She was one of ours, and she was using what she carried to hold a city's grief hostage, feeding on it. He said it without expression. The grief of 3,000 people, held and recirculated rather than allowed to pass through and release. It was, the word that comes closest is obscene. So you stopped her. I stopped her, and then I was stopped, he said. Because my people have laws, and one of the oldest of those laws is that no Ashfeld kills another, regardless of reason. Mara was quiet for a moment. That's a law written by people who've never had to enforce it, she said finally. He turned and looked at her with an expression she was starting to be able to read. The slight widening at the outer corners of his eyes, the very small softening around his mouth. It was the expression he made when she said something that landed somewhere inside his thinking. Yes, he said. That is almost exactly what I said, at the time. By the fourth Saturday, she had stopped pretending that she wasn't looking forward to seeing him. By the sixth, she had given up the fiction that he was only an interesting stranger. By the eighth, she was waking up on Saturday mornings with a feeling in her chest that she recognized from an earlier version of her life, and had thought she'd finished with. A kind of low, bright warmth, uncomfortable and good in equal measure. He was careful with her. That was one of the things she noticed most, in those weeks of Saturday evenings, by the cemetery gate, or in her kitchen, or once, unexpectedly, walking along the canal 2 miles away, where they had ended up after an evening that stretched later than she'd planned. He was careful with her in the way very strong things were careful with fragile things. Not because he thought she was fragile. She had the impression that he thought no such thing, but because he was aware of the difference in what they were, and he took that difference seriously. He never touched her without reason. He never pushed forward into spaces she had not already opened. He waited, with an absolutely infuriating patience that she suspected was not patience at all, but simply his natural state, stretched out and still and present. But she caught him sometimes. She caught him when the distance between closed for some ordinary reason. When she reached past him for something, and her arm brushed his sleeve. When they sat on the step, and the night was cold, and she leaned slightly in his direction, and he did not move away. She caught the way his stillness changed in those moments, the way it deepened rather than relaxed, the way his hands would still on whatever they were holding, and she knew that careful was not the same as indifferent. And she filed that knowledge somewhere close to her sternum. On the 9th Saturday it rained. She had her umbrella and he did not, which somehow she had not anticipated. And she stood in her doorway and watched him come up the street in the rain, with his coat soaked through, and his dark hair flattened, and said, "You are 500 years old, and you forgot an umbrella." "I don't feel cold," he said from the bottom of her steps. "You look like a wet cat." "Your cat looks better than I do," he agreed, and shook the water off his coat with a motion that was very controlled and somehow still graceful. And she pressed herself back against the doorframe to let him in. And he came through the door, and the warmth of the hallway hit him, and he stopped. And she was close enough to see the water on his eyelashes and the pulse point at the base of his throat, and the way his chest rose and fell with a breath that was deeper than usual. "Calder," she said. "Mara," he said. Neither of them moved for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. Then she stepped back and he stepped forward, and the door closed behind him, and she went to get a towel. And her hands were not quite steady. That night, sitting on her couch with the rain on the windows and 2 cups of tea on the coffee table, and her cat occupying the armchair, with the moral authority of someone who lives there, he told her what releasing the seal would actually require. Not the general version he'd given her on the first night, the careful explanation of binding and verith and complementary natures. The specific version. Contact, he said, sustained contact. Not, it doesn't have to be. He stopped and regrouped, which she had never seen him do before, and she found herself paying very close attention. The binding recognizes a verith by resonance. Proximity activates it, as you've seen. To fully release it, the resonance has to reach a certain threshold. That requires physical contact that is voluntary and prolonged. How prolonged, she said. He looked at his hands. An hour, perhaps less. Perhaps more. I don't know precisely. The last time it was documented, the conditions were different. "Someone else released an Ashfeld?" she asked. "Once," he said, "centuries ago. It was recorded, but the details they are not all ones I have full access to." He paused. "The point is that I am telling you because I want you to understand that I am not, that what I want is not contingent on this. I am not asking you to release the seal." Mara looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. "Do you?" he said very quietly. You have been very careful for 9 Saturdays, she said. I've noticed. Something moved in his face again. She was getting better at reading it, this face that was not used to being read, that had spent 5 centuries composing itself into stillness. Yes, he said. Has it been? She stopped. Started again. Has it been difficult? Being careful? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, You have no idea. She reached across the space between them on the couch and took his left hand in both of hers, and she turned his wrist over so the mark was face up. It was dark and still, the way it had been every time she'd seen it except the first night. But as she held it, as the seconds stretched into a minute, and she felt the warmth of his skin against her palms, she felt something change. A faint heat that didn't come from body temperature, a pressure deep and low, like the feeling before weather. The mark did not glow, not yet, but it moved, the lines of it, very slightly. A shift she might have imagined except that she felt it in her palms, a vibration like a string finding its note. Calder's breath had changed. Okay, she said. She set his hand back on his knee carefully. Because she was a practical woman, and also because she needed to be able to think. Okay, I need you to tell me the rest. The rest, he said, and his voice was slightly rougher than usual. What happens to you specifically when it releases? What changes? I need to know before I decide anything. He nodded. He composed himself back into stillness, or tried to. She could see the effort of it in a way she hadn't been able to before. I recover full access to what I carry, the winter force. I will be for a period, I don't know the duration, substantially more than I am now. Stronger, more present. He paused. The world will feel me for a while. Weather may respond, animals. Places that hold coldness already. Old stone, deep water, the upper atmosphere. Will you be dangerous? Not to you, he said, and said it with a certainty that had no room for qualification. To others, only if I choose to be, he said. And I will have had 500 years of practice in choosing not to be. And then it settles, he said. I become what I was before the binding, but with 500 years of stillness, patience. I am told that changes a person. He said that last part with a dryness that she recognized, and she felt warmth move through her in a way that had nothing to do with the heating system. Tell me what you were like, she said, before. He considered this. Impatient, he said finally. Certain, very certain of a great many things and not always right to be. And now I am less certain, he said, which is either wisdom or damage. I have not decided. I think, Mara said, that it's possible to have both. He looked at her. That expression again, the slight opening at the corners of his eyes, the softening, the look of something that had expected the world to keep being what it had been, and was finding that it was not. Yes, he said, I think that's probably right. She did not release the seal that night. She had thought about it, lying in bed afterward with the rain still going, and her cat arranged at her feet, with pointed disregard for her emotional state. And she had understood that she was not ready, not because she doubted what it would mean, but because she needed to know what she herself meant by it. The releasing was not the difficult part. The releasing was a single act, and she was a woman who could commit to acts when she understood their consequences. What she needed to understand was the consequences of choosing it, choosing him, choosing whatever would exist on the other side of it. When the seal was gone, and he was standing in her kitchen at full capacity, and they both had to decide what they were to each other. She needed one more Saturday. She almost didn't get it. The trouble had been building in the weeks before she understood what it was. She had noticed on her Thursday nights through the cemetery that the fog was different, thicker, and with an edge to it that felt less like weather and more like intention. She had noticed that the iron gate, which had always been cold in the way old iron was cold, had been actively, aggressively frigid in a way that made her pull her hand back. She had noticed that twice in the past 2 weeks, walking home from a late Thursday shift, she had felt watched, and not in the way she felt Calder's particular attention, which she had learned to recognize, had perhaps been recognizing for months before she acknowledged what it was. This was something else. This was older and less careful and wholly uninterested in her as a person. She told Calder on Saturday evening, the 10th one, and she watched his stillness harden into something different. Describe it precisely, he said. She described it precisely. The thickness of the fog, the cold in the iron, the sensation of being watched by something that was looking through her rather than at her. He was quiet for a moment, then, "The others of my kind know what I am," he said carefully. "They have always known. There was never a possibility of hiding it. What I didn't know was whether any of them would, whether they would have reason to involve themselves. What reason would they have? If the seal releases," he said, "I am full Ashveld again. I am a voice in the council of what remains of my people, if there is still a council. I was before, significant in a particular hierarchy. Someone may not want that restored." "Someone in your people," Mara said. "Yes." "Who would have benefit from you staying sealed?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Those who currently hold positions of influence that they could not hold if I were present to contest them," he said. "My people have not been idle in 5 centuries. I have been. There is a great deal that has changed that I don't know about, and someone may prefer to keep it that way." "So someone's been watching me," Mara said, "to make sure I don't. To find out how close we are to the threshold," he said, "or to interfere before we reach it." She was quiet for a moment, doing the math that came from practical experience rather than paranormal knowledge. "When were you going to tell me this was a possibility?" The pause before his answer was fractionally longer than it should have been. "I had hoped it wouldn't be necessary," he said. "Calder, I know," he said. "That was I know." She stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the street below, which was ordinary, which was dark and wet, and had 2 parked cars and a lamppost with a bag caught at its base. She stood there and was angry, properly angry, the kind that sat in the shoulders and jaw, and she let herself be angry for a minute without doing anything about it. "I am not," she said without turning around, "a person who needs to be managed." "No," he said. "You are not, and I managed you anyway, and I was wrong to." She turned around. He was standing now, because he had stood when she did, and he was looking at her with his hands at his sides, and an expression that was not composed. She had never seen his face uncomposed before, and the rawness of it was startling. This face that had arranged itself into patience and stillness for 500 years, open and unguarded in her kitchen. "As I was afraid," he said, "that if I told you there was danger, you would step back. That the practical decision, the sensible decision, would be to distance yourself from me, and I was—" He stopped, started again. "I am not accustomed to wanting things. The binding suppresses it along with everything else. But I want—" He did not finish the sentence. "Tell me what you want," she said. He looked at her. "You," he said plainly and completely. "I want you. Whatever that is permitted to mean in the context of what I am and what you are, and the significant distance between our circumstances." Something in Mara's chest cracked open in a way that was not unpleasant. She breathed through it. "Okay," she said. "We can discuss the significant distance between our circumstances later. Right now you need to tell me everything about whoever is watching this building and what they're actually capable of." He told her. The one watching them was called Veth, and Veth was not a proper name but a title, a designation for the kind of Ashveld who policed others of their kind. An enforcer, older than Calder, which was saying something, and holding Winter in the way Calder held it. Not complementarily, but as a weapon. The watch wasn't Veth's initiative, he explained. Veth served whoever currently held the authority of the Ashveld Council, and that meant someone had sent Veth, and that someone had specific reasons for not wanting the seal broken. "Can Veth stop it?" Mara asked. Veth can try to stop you reaching me," he said. "If you're not near me, the resonance can't build. Or Veth can act after when I'm in transition. The period immediately after the seal breaks, before I've stabilized, is the most vulnerable I will ever be." "How vulnerable?" "Very," he said simply. Mara thought about this. She was sitting at the kitchen table again, and her tea had gone cold, and she was turning the mug in her hands, which was something she did when she was thinking. How much time do we have before Veth decides to do something active, rather than passive? "Veth has been passive because Veth is uncertain," he said. Watching was reconnaissance. If Veth reports back to whoever sent them and that person decides the risk is real. He paused. "We may not have much time." "Then we don't wait," she said. He looked at her. "I wasn't going to wait long anyway," she said. I told you I needed one more Saturday to think, and I've been thinking, about it since about the third Saturday, if I'm honest, which I am. She set the mug down. I know what this means. I know what I'm choosing. I just needed to be sure I was choosing it for the right reasons and not because I was caught up in something, he offered. I was going to say frightened, she said. I wanted to make sure I wasn't releasing the seal because I was scared of what would happen if I didn't. That's a bad reason to do anything. And I'm not, she said. I'm doing it because I want to. Because this, you, is something I want to be true. She looked at him steadily. Is that sufficient? That is more than sufficient, he said, and his voice was very low. Then come here, she said. He moved around the table and stopped an arm's length from her, and she stood up and closed the remaining distance herself. And she took his left hand in both of hers the way she had on the 9th Saturday. Only this time she held it against her chest, over the center of her sternum where the warmth had been living for weeks. And the seal woke up. It was not gradual, the way it had been when she'd held his wrist on the couch. It was immediate and total, a flood of amber light from the mark on his wrist that spilled up through her palms, and she felt it not as heat but as recognition. Her whole body saying yes, the way a body said yes to music it had heard before and not known it had been missing. The mark blazed and the light spread up his arm, and she could see the lines of it moving, the complex patterns shifting and recomposing, and his breath was coming fast and uneven, and his free hand found her face, her cheek, his thumb against the line of her jaw. Mara, he said. I know, she said. You need to stay close, he said, through the transition. I know, she said again. She pressed his hand harder against her chest. I'm not going anywhere. The kitchen window rattled. The cold radiating from him was not the cold of temperature, but the cold of what he had said. Winter as a presence, as a force, the still moment before snow, the clean edge of a world that had finished its dying and was waiting to be new. She felt it move through her, and she didn't flinch from it, stood into it the way you stood into a wind that was strong enough to lean against. The seal began to come apart, not violently, not the way she might have imagined it, some dramatic shattering or explosive release. It unmade itself with the same patience it had been assembled with, line by line, the complex architecture of it dissolving from the edges inward, and as each line released, she felt the change in him, a deepening, a widening, like a room suddenly becoming much larger than its walls had suggested. He was still standing in front of her, but he was also more than standing, more than the dimensions she had been able to perceive, and she kept her hands on his and her feet on the kitchen floor and breathed. The cat made a sound from somewhere deeper in the apartment. One short sound, then silence. His eyes changed. That was the thing she would remember most clearly later. The eyes she had been cataloging for 10 Saturdays. Not brown, not gold, went luminous. Not glowing, not theatrical. Luminous, the way deep water looked when light hit it at the right angle. Something in them that had no analogy in ordinary vision. Mara, he said, and her name in his voice with that resonance in it hit her somewhere below the collarbone and stayed. Hi, she said, because she was Mara Voss and she was from upstate New York. Something broke across his face then, something she could only call joy, wild and sudden and apparently entirely unexpected by him. And he bent his head and pressed his forehead to hers, and the last line of the seal dissolved with a pulse that she felt in every bone, a deep, clean note, like a bell that had been struck and was only now, after 5 centuries, allowed to finish ringing. Then the window blew in, not the glass. The latch gave, and the window swung hard on its hinges, and the cold that came through it was the other kind, the weaponized kind, the kind that had intent behind it, and Mara felt it hit the side of her face and turned instinctively. And there in the open window frame was a shape. Not a person, not entirely. A density in the air that had resolved itself into the outline of a figure, and the fog from the street was moving in around it, and the temperature in the room had dropped 20 degrees in 2 seconds. Calder put himself between Mara and the window. It was not a gesture she had time to feel anything about, because things were moving fast and the figure in the window was Veth. And Veth had apparently decided reconnaissance was over. The cold that came from the window pressed against the cold that now filled Calder like a vast and patient sea. And Mara understood in that moment what she had released. She understood it in the way you understood weather, not intellectually but physically, the scale of it, the depth of it, the fact that winter as a force was not simply one season but the hinge point of the world, the thing that ended and cleared and made renewal possible. And Calder carried it fully now, and he stood between it and her. And she felt the two cold things meet in the air of her kitchen like two fronts colliding. Veth, Calder said. He did not raise his voice, he did not need to. The shape in the window frame shifted. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere in the cold at once. You were sealed, it said. You had no right to release. I had no obligation to be sealed for the convenience of whoever you serve, Calder said. The council. I would hear from the council directly, Calder said. Not from its instrument. The cold intensified. Mara felt it against her back, her hands, felt it trying to find a way around Calder to get to her. And she understood that this was the strategy, not to challenge him directly, not yet, but to get to her, the Varath, the one who had unmade the binding, and remove her from the equation. Destabilize what had been established. She stepped to the side of Calder and not behind him. No, Calder said very quietly, just to her. I'm not hiding, she said equally quietly. That's not what I do. She looked at the shape in her window frame. She was aware that she was a woman in her kitchen in a sweater and work-worn jeans, staring down something that was several centuries old and built of ice and authority. And she was also aware that she had released a seal that had contained an Ashveld for 500 years, which made her the Varath in fact and not just in name. And a Varath was not someone to be managed or removed or gone around. Get out of my window, she said. The cold was a fist around the room. It should have silenced her. It should have turned her voice to nothing. It didn't. Later she would not be able to explain precisely why. Calder would tell her, in the slow, quiet aftermath, that the Varath's function was not merely to release the seal, but to be the stable point around which the Ashveld oriented themselves. The anchor that kept the force they carried from moving uncontrolled. The human-scale weight that gave the winter force somewhere to be. He would tell her that Veth's cold was a weapon, but hers was a ground. And ground always wins against a weapon that needs something to push against. She didn't know any of that in the moment. In the moment she just knew that she was tired of being managed, and tired of the cold that wasn't hers, and tired of things being decided over her head. And she let the warmth of what Calder carried, which was in her palms still, she could feel it, that resonance that had lit the seal and broken it. She let it come forward like a breath, and she looked at Veth and she said, whatever you were sent to protect, it's done. He's free. Go tell whoever needs to know. The shape in the window frame was very still. Then, without a word, without ceremony, it withdrew. The fog pulled back. The temperature in the kitchen climbed 10 degrees in 10 seconds. The window hung open on its broken latch, and the ordinary October night came in, smelling of rain and diesel and the far edge of the river. Calder let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. Are you all right? Mara asked. Yes, he said. He turned. He looked at her with those luminous eyes, and his face was... She had no word for his face. Everything that 5 centuries of stillness had learned to suppress was moving through it at once. And she didn't try to name the parts of it, just looked at it and let it be what it was. That was... He started. I know, she said. You didn't have to stand beside me, he said. Yes, I did, she said. That's who I am. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, and his hands found her face with that same careful precision, thumbs against her jaw, and the cold of him was the good kind now, the clean, vast kind, and she stood into it. His forehead came to hers again, and they stood there with the window still open, and the October night coming in around them, and she could feel his pulse through his palms, and it was slow and even, and very, very present. What happens now? She said into the small space between them. Now, he said, I have to present myself to whatever remains of my people and account for the seal's breaking. There will be confrontations. People who are inconvenienced by my return to full capacity. Will they send Veth again? They'll send something, he said. Veth was a first move, there will be others. Okay, she said. Mara, this is. I heard you, she said. There will be others. There will be confrontations. You will have to navigate the politics of a several hundred-year-old supernatural hierarchy and deal with people who are not happy you're free. She lifted her face slightly so she could see his eyes. Are you about to tell me that I should think carefully about what I'm walking into? I was, he admitted. Don't, she said. You are extraordinarily. I know, she said. Don't. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but contained the architecture of one. Then his hands shifted, one cupping her face, the other moving to the back of her head, and she had exactly enough time to understand what was happening before his mouth found hers. It was not a tentative kiss. It was not the kiss of someone uncertain about whether they should be kissing at all. It was the kiss of someone who had been 500 years patient and had just run out of reason to be patient any longer. And it was warm. Unexpectedly, entirely warm. And she rose up on her toes into it and felt the whole winter force of him like a season turning, and the open window brought the October night around them, and her hands found the front of his coat and held on. When they separated, the world was slightly different from how it had been. Not dramatically. The kitchen was still her kitchen, with the card table and the vinyl cloth with blue flowers, and the hook on the wall where the iron skillet hung. The cat reappeared in the doorway from the hall, looked at the two of them with an expression that managed to convey both disapproval and concession, and went to her bowl. You should fix the window latch, Calder said. You could fix the window latch, she said. He looked at the window, something that might have been a small wind, or might have been something else entirely, moved through the kitchen, and the latch clicked back into place. Show off, she said. I've been suppressed for 5 centuries, he said. Allow me a window latch, she laughed. She turned away to put the kettle on because her tea was cold and her hands needed something to do. And she was aware of him behind her, the fact of him, in her kitchen, the new scale of him, the vast cold patience of what he was fully present, in the small warm space of what she had built, in these 3 years of rebuilding. Calder, she said. Yes, what do you actually need right now? Not what comes next in terms of your people, or the council or any of it. Right now, in this kitchen, what do you need? The pause was long. She turned around to look at him, and he was standing at the table with his hands flat on the vinyl cloth, looking down at them, at the wrist where the seal used to be, and was now only skin, clear and unmarked in the kitchen light. I need to not be alone in it, he said finally. That is the thing I have been most alone in for a very long time. Then sit down, she said gently. I'll make tea, and you can tell me everything, all of it. The parts you've been careful about, the parts you held back, the parts you decided I shouldn't worry about yet. All of it. He sat down. He looked at her with eyes that were luminous and ancient, and something she was going to spend a very long time learning. And something in his face settled. Not collapsed, settled, the way a great tension releases into something more sustainable. That will take longer than tonight, he said. Yes, she said. I expect it will. She put 2 mugs on the table. She sat down across from him. Outside, October was doing what October did, turning the world down to its essentials, clearing the excess, leaving what was clean and necessary and built to last. Over the next weeks, the consequences arrived the way consequences did when you had made a major and irrevocable decision, not all at once, but in waves, each one manageable in itself, the accumulation of them requiring all the resources she had. 3 days after the broken seal, a woman appeared at the diner. She sat at the counter during the late shift, and she drank coffee with the patience of someone who had no actual interest in coffee. And she watched Mara work with the same quality of attention Mara had learned to recognize. Not Veth. Her cold was of a different character, older, less aggressive, more like deep winter than weaponized ice. She left before the end of the shift without speaking, but she left a card on the counter. It was blank on both sides except for a mark in the upper right corner that Mara recognized as a variation of what had been on Calder's wrist. When she showed it to Calder, his expression changed to something she hadn't seen before. That's the recorder's mark, he said. The recorder, the historian of my people, the one who documents what happens and how. He turned the card over. If the recorder came personally, it means this has been officially noted. The breaking of the seal, which means I have standing again. That's good, she said. It means someone contested whether the breaking was legitimate. he said. And the recorder came to assess. Also good, presumably, since she left without doing anything. Yes, he said. It means she assessed and found no reason to invalidate it. Because it was legitimate, Mara said. Because you are a Varath, he said. There is no ambiguity in what you are, and therefore no ambiguity in the breaking. She came to verify, and she has verified. The woman did not come back to the diner, but the following Tuesday, when Mara was walking home along the canal path that she had started taking, since the night Calder had walked it with her, she felt the quality of the air change, and she stopped and said, without looking around, I know you're there. You can come out or you can go away. But I'm not walking faster and I'm not pretending. Nothing happened for a moment. Then a man stepped out from the shadow of the old mill building along the canal. And he was short and slight, and looked perhaps 60 years old, in the way Calder looked perhaps 35, which was to say not at all accurately. He had pale eyes and white hair, and he held his hands visible and open. You're braver than expected, he said, not as criticism, as information. People keep saying that like it's a surprise, Mara said. For a Varath, yes, he said. It's unusual. In our recorded history, the Varath have generally been. He paused, searching for the word accommodating, oriented toward connection and harmony rather than direct confrontation. I can be harmonious, Mara said. I can also tell Veth to get out of my window. Both are true. Something softened in the man's pale eyes. Yes, he said. Both are true. He paused. I am called Aaron. I was a friend of Calder's once. Mara looked at him for a long moment. Once, she said. Before the sealing, he said. I voted for it. He said it with the directness of someone who had decided that the only option was total honesty. I believed the law required it, and that Calder had broken the law, and the consequences were the consequences. I have had 500 years to consider that decision. Have you changed your mind? About the law? He considered. The law was the law. About Calder? He looked at the canal, the black water reflecting the streetlights. I have thought often about what Solvith was doing, what she was feeding on. I have wondered what I would have done if I had been the one present. He paused. I don't know that I would have done differently. I know that I would not have wanted to be sealed for it. Are you here for him? Mara asked. Or for me, for you, he said. To tell you that there are those among my people who are not opposed to his return, who believe the sentence was served and the breaking is legitimate, and who are prepared to say so. He paused. And to tell you that the one who sent Veth is not done. Who sent Veth? Mara said. Not a question. A woman called Ciri, he said. She holds the position of Winter Arbiter, the one who oversees questions of force and its use among our people. A position that Calder would have held, had he not been sealed. She has held it for 400 years. And she doesn't want to give it up, Mara said. She has built something substantial in that role, Aaron said. I will not say she has done it entirely badly, but some of what she has built would not survive Calder's scrutiny, and she knows it. What does she want? Mara asked. Specifically, what would satisfy her? Aaron looked at her, apparently surprised by the specificity of the question. If I had to guess, he said slowly, she wants your removal. Not harm. I don't believe Saray would authorize harm to a Varath. The taboos around harming a Varath are older than any individual authority. But if you were to choose to step back, if you were to decide not to be what you are in relation to him, he would return to the seal's effect. Not the seal itself, it cannot be rebound, but the suppressed state. That won't happen, Mara said. I expected that answer, Aaron said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite a smile and not quite grief. He found well. She told Calder about Aaron that evening, sitting on the couch with the cat this time occupying the space between them with cheerful obliviousness, and she watched him go through several things at once when she mentioned the name. Shock first, brief, and quickly managed. Then something slower and less readable. He voted for the sealing, Calder said. He told me, she said. He also said he spent 500 years thinking about it. Calder was quiet. He said he was a friend, Mara said before. He was, Calder said. One of my closest. He looked at the wall, at nothing in particular. I don't. I have not thought much about the ones who voted for it. I understood the law. I knew what I had done, and I knew what the law said. I didn't. It's different, somehow. Knowing that Aaron, That the people who knew you still voted for it, she said. Yes. He's carrying it, she said. I could hear it. Calder turned to look at her. You read him in 5 minutes on a canal path. People are very readable when they're being honest, she said. And he was being honest. All the way honest, the kind that costs something. She paused. If you want to see him, I think you should. I think it might be. I think you've been very alone in this, and having one of your own people who was there and regrets it and has standing in the current situation seems like something that would help. He looked at her for a long moment. You amaze me, he said quietly, consistently, in a way I had not anticipated. I had a very good mother, she said. She taught me that isolation never solved anything that connection couldn't solve better. I'd like to hear about her, he said. I know, she said, I'll tell you. But Calder, what are you going to do about Sirai? He was quiet for a moment. The cat, apparently deciding that the conversation had moved to something too serious for feline comfort, relocated to the armchair. I need to present myself to the full council, he said. Not just the recorder, not just individual voices, the full body, and I need to speak on my own behalf. And I need to make the case that what I carry is not a threat to my people but a resource. And that the one who finds it a threat is doing so for reasons that are personal rather than legitimate. Will they listen? Some will. Some won't. He paused. It will depend significantly on how strong my position is when I stand before them. And the strength of your position depends on me, she said. The strength of my position depends on the seal being legitimately broken, he said. Which it is. But yes, the Vareth's presence at a presentation it carries weight. It says that the Ashveld is anchored, stable, not a danger to those around him. Then I'll be there, she said. He looked at her again with that expression she had spent weeks learning to read. The one that showed up when she said something that reached him. You don't know what that involves, he said. Tell me, she said, and then I'll be there. The council presentation happened on a night when the temperature dropped to the edge of frost, and the stars came out hard and clear. The kind of night that had an edge to it, an honesty. Aaron had arranged it. Had turned out to have more standing than Mara had realized from that first conversation on the canal. Had spoken on her behalf in whatever preliminary processes she wasn't privy to, and had done it with the weight of someone who was paying a debt and knew it. They met in a place that looked, on the outside, like an old warehouse near the docks. The kind of building that had been many things and was currently in between identities, blank-faced and patient. On the inside, it was different. A space that was more than its physical dimensions suggested. The walls deeper than walls should be, and the ceiling higher than the roof allowed. And the cold in it was the gathered cold of all the Ashveld present, which was not many but was significant. There were 8 of them, including Calder, 7 who had either never been sealed or had been released in the past, and Calder, newly free, and Mara beside him, which was a thing that apparently had not happened in the recorded history of council presentations, because the recorder, sitting to the left of the room's center with a small book that looked older than most of the city, made a note with visible attention. Sirai sat at the far end of the assembled group, and Mara looked at her and understood immediately and completely. She was tall, in the way Calder was tall, and her cold was enormous, and she had the face of someone who had been right about most things for most of a very long life, and whose identity had quietly become inseparable from that rightness. She was looking at Calder with an expression that held several centuries' worth of complexity. And she was looking at Mara with an expression that was more readable and less kind. Mara met it directly and held it until Sirai looked away. Calder spoke. She had heard him speak carefully before, with precision and patience. But this was different. This was Calder at full Ashveld, his voice carrying the resonance of what he was, Winterforce present and acknowledged and controlled, and she felt it the way she felt weather, in the skin and the lungs and the fine bones of her inner ear. He spoke about Solvith, which was the oldest business and had to be addressed first, and he spoke about it with a clarity that left no room for revision. He spoke about the 5 centuries of the seals, and what he had used them to become. He spoke about Mara. He said her name, once, quietly, and she felt the way the room responded to it, the slight shift in every presence there, the acknowledgement of what a Verith meant. And he said that the breaking of the seal had been voluntary and mutual, and that he stood before them now not as a supplicant asking for return, but as a full member of his people claiming the standing that was his. Then Sirey spoke. She was eloquent, which Mara had expected, and she was not without legitimate points, which Mara had also expected, and she was more frightened than she was letting show, which Mara noticed and filed away. She spoke about the stability that had been established in Calder's absence. She spoke about the difficulty of reintegrating a full Ashfeld who had not been part of the active council for 5 centuries. She spoke about the Varath, carefully and with none of her actual feeling about it visible, framing her concern as procedural rather than personal. When she finished, Mara asked if she could speak. The recorder made another note. Aaron, standing near the left wall, watched with an expression that was hoping for something. She had not prepared remarks. She had thought about what she would say if asked, and she had understood that prepared remarks were not the right tool for this. That what this room needed from her was not argument but reality, not rhetoric but presence. So she stood and she said what was true. She said that she was a woman who had been having a difficult few years and was not supernatural and had not gone looking for any of this. And that the first thing Calder had done when he understood what she was had been to be honest with her and let her choose. And that every time she had needed to know something he had told her when she asked directly. And that the one time he had failed to do, that he had acknowledged it without being asked and without making it small. She said that she was not going to provide a point-by-point response to Sirey's concerns because they were not actually about policy. She said that she understood why Siresier had built she had built and why she was protecting it, and that she was not here to take anything from her. That Calder being free did not require Sirey to be diminished, that there was room for both of them, that the only question was whether the people in this room could see that. She stopped. She looked at the 8 Ashfeld in the room, at the recorder who was writing steadily, at Aaron, whose expression had resolved into something that was simply and fully relief, at Sirey, whose face was doing something that was not quite what it had been doing before. I released the seal because I chose to, she said. It was the best choice I've made in 3 years, and I would make it again. The cold in the room was very quiet for a moment. Then the one they called the recorder closed her book and said, "The breaking stands. The status is confirmed." She said it the way facts were stated, without emphasis or drama, and that was that. It was not entirely that, of course. The weeks and months after were full of the smaller complications and navigating what it meant for Calder to be present in the world again. The adjustments required on both their parts, for 2 people who were separately self-sufficient, to learn to be with each other in a sustained way, the occasional friction of his vast patience rubbing against her practical impatience in matters that did not require patience, the recurring awareness of everything they were still in the process of telling each other. Sirey did not become an ally, but she became something that was at least not an adversary. Aaron came to dinner one November evening. At the actual table, Mara had finally bought to replace the card table, a solid second-hand one she'd found at an estate sale, too large for the kitchen and somehow exactly right. And he and Calder sat across from each other and talked for 6 hours while she sat with her tea and mostly listened and watched 5 centuries of friendship find its footing again. She thought about her mother on the drive home from the estate sale where she'd bought the table, loading it into the truck she'd borrowed from the hardware store owner downstairs. Her mother had said, specifically, in one of those conversations that Mara kept in the best curated part of her memory, that the right person was not the person who arrived in your life when everything was easy. The right person arrived in the rubble and sat down in it with you and said, "Well, what do we have to work with?" She thought about what she had to work with and found herself laughing a little in the cab of the borrowed truck, the table filling the bed behind her. What she had to work with was a man who was 500 years old and had been sealed for most of that, and was working through what it meant to be fully himself again, and doing it honestly and carefully, and with a patience that was not resignation but choice. A man who had stood in a council of his own people and claimed his standing without apology. A man who had pressed his forehead to hers in her kitchen and said he wanted her, plainly and completely, with no performance around it. She also had a too large kitchen table, a cat who had decided Calder was acceptable, a diner job that was still supposed to be temporary, a set of blisters that were finally healing because she had bought better shoes, and a cemetery she still walked through on Thursday nights because she had always liked the quiet of it, and because the gate no longer felt cold in the way it used to. Winter came fully in December the way it did. Not gently, not apologetically, but with conviction. The first real snow came on a Thursday, and she walked home through it with her coat collar up and snowflakes accumulating on her shoulders. And she thought about winter as a force, as the thing that ended what needed ending and cleared what needed clearing, the honesty of it, the clean, necessary fact of it. She found Calder standing on the sidewalk outside her building, looking up at the snow coming down, and he had his face turned up to it with an expression that she stood at the corner for a moment just to look at. Unguarded, unheld, open in the way she had seen his face open in her kitchen on the night the seal broke. But more than that now, more settled, less raw. A man who had been cold for 5 centuries finally standing in cold he had chosen. He heard her feet on the sidewalk and turned. Those eyes, luminous and not quite gold, finding her across the falling snow. "You're going to be impossible in winter, aren't you?" she said, walking toward him. "Very probably," he said. "I'm going to find you standing in snowdrifts at 2 in the morning feeling pleased about things." "That is almost certainly going to happen," he agreed. She reached him and he put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into the vast patient cold of him, and they stood there in the falling snow outside the hardware store, and the apartment above it where she had rebuilt a life, and she felt exactly where she was. This street, this city, this man, this particular moment in October's wake, winter just properly beginning. "Tell me something you haven't told me yet," she said. He was quiet for a moment, snow settling on his coat, on her hair. "When I was waiting," he said, "in the 11 months before I found you, I used to watch the building and tell myself I was assessing the situation, being strategic." He paused. "But I was also just watching you come and go, watching you come home late with your bag and your coat and your blisters. You could tell I had blisters from a distance?" "I could tell a lot from a distance," he said, "including that you were someone who kept going when it would have been reasonable to stop. That was the first thing I knew about you. Long before the seal." She thought about that. The ordinary version of her life, the version that had no sea and no Ashfeld, and no cemetery gate, and no not quite gold eyes. The version that was just a woman rebuilding something in a rented apartment above a hardware store, coming home late with soup and bad shoes, and the fact that all of it had been witnessed, patiently and without announcement, by something old and still, and waiting for her to come close enough. "Okay," she said. Agreed. The snow came down. The street was very quiet, the way streets went quiet in the first snow of the year, muffled and clean, the world simplified. She thought about the phone call 3 years ago, and her mother's house and the things she had lost, and the things she had built in the losing, and she thought about iron gates and seals that had not glowed in 5 centuries. And she thought about the warmth in her palms when she had held his wrist, the recognition of it, the absolute inevitability of it that she had felt in her bones. She had asked him once, in those early Saturdays, whether he thought's possible to have both wisdom and damage. He had said he thought she was probably right. She put her hand in his, her fingers lacing through fingers that held winter like a held breath, and the snow came down on both of them with perfect impartiality. And she thought, yes, she thought, both, she thought, and I would choose it again.